The news headlines say I was kidnapped by my dangerous ex-con stepbrother. They say he brainwashed the billionaire heiress. The truth is much darker. My father tried to destroy us to protect his image, so we destroyed his empire. We robbed him of millions while he slept, stole his vintage Porsche, and vanished across the border. I'm not a victim. I'm the mastermind. And while the world mourns the poor princess, I'm drinking cocktails on a beach, built on the ruins of the family I burned to the ground. My father's penthouse on Fifth Avenue was less a home and more a fortress of glass and steel, a structure designed to suspend us high above the grit and the noise of New York City like gods looking down on a teeming anthill. The air up here was scrubbed clean of the exhaust fumes and the scent of roasting nuts that defined the streets below, replaced by the cloying, expensive fragrance of fresh lilies and old money. It was a world of hermetically sealed silence, where the chaos of the metropolis was reduced to a silent, twinkling light show, and the only sounds were the polite chiming of crystal flutes and the low, cultured laughter of people who owned the skyline. I stood by the grand piano, clutching a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking, feeling like a doll placed in a diorama, waiting for the next act of my father's life to begin. In the center of the room, standing beneath the cascading light of a chandelier that cost more than most people earned in a decade, stood my father, looking every inch the master of the universe in a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. He was beaming, a predator who had just secured a new prize, as he introduced us to Evelyn, his new wife. She was, admittedly, flawless, a high-powered defense attorney with the posture of a queen and skin the color of polished mahogany. She moved through the room with a grace that commanded attention. She was the perfect addition to his collection, a symbol of his progressive modernism and his continued virility, and she played her part with an effortless, terrifying charm. However, my gaze was not fixed on the radiant couple, but rather on the shadow that loomed just behind them, a dark tear in the pristine fabric of the evening. His name was Dante, Evelyn's son from a life she had left behind long ago, and he was the variable that refused to fit into my father's calculated equation. At 21 years old, he was a year older than me, but his eyes held a weary, cynical ancientness that made him seem decades my senior. He stood with his shoulders hunched, hands deep in his pockets, radiating a sullen, kinetic energy that made the air around him feel heavy and volatile. He was dressed in a deliberate act of rebellion, wearing a cheap, threadbare t-shirt that strained against the thick muscles of his chest and shoulders, and a pair of denim jeans that were stained with flecks of dried paint and grease. He looked like he had just walked off a construction site or out of a holding cell, a stark, violent contrast to the sea of silk and velvet that surrounded him. He did not smile at the guests. He did not offer his hand. Instead, he watched the room with a look of undisguised contempt, his dark eyes dissecting the collection of vintage wines, the abstract art, and the people with a cold, judging precision. When his gaze finally landed on me, standing there in my pale silk dress like a ghost in the corner, I felt a physical jolt, as if he had reached across the room and shoved me. There was no warmth in his look, no brotherly affection or even polite curiosity. There was only a deep, simmering disdain for everything I represented. He looked at me and saw a spoiled princess in a glass tower, a soft creature protected by daddy's money, and he made no effort to hide his disgust. I wanted to look away, to retreat into the safety of my boredom, but I found myself paralyzed, pinned by the intensity of his judgment. My father cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the acoustics of the room, and raised his glass to propose a toast to the new, happy family he had assembled. The guests quieted down, turning their beaming faces toward him, ready to applaud the merger. As my father began to speak of unity and the future, Dante moved. He did not walk toward the group. He walked away from it, moving with a prowling, silent grace toward the massive floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of Central Park and the city beyond. The movement was a disruption, a visual dissonance that drew my eye away from my father's performance. I watched as Dante stopped inches from the glass, his reflection hovering ghost-like over the city lights. He reached into the pocket of his jeans and withdrew a thick, black permanent marker, the kind used by vandals to tag subway cars. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what he was about to do. He uncapped the marker, the small motion seeming incredibly loud in my mind, and pressed the felt tip against the pristine $1,000,000 glass. He did not look at the view. He turned his head slightly, locking eyes with me across the expanse of the room, ensuring that I was the sole witness to his crime. With a slow, deliberate screech that set my teeth on edge, he dragged the marker across the window, drawing a thick, jagged black line that slashed through the perfect view, separating us from the abyss of the city. It was a scar on the face of perfection, a brutal, ugly mark that could not be wiped away. It was a declaration of war, a silent promise that he was not here to blend in or play the role of the grateful stepson. In that singular, destructive gesture, there was no fear of consequence, no respect for authority, only the promise of the chaos he had brought with him into my sterile, airless home. He capped the marker and slipped it back into his pocket, offering me a small, terrifying smirk that told me the glass castle was no longer safe, and the siege had officially begun. Life inside the penthouse rapidly dissolved into a sophisticated form of trench warfare. A silent and bitter Cold War fought across the expanse of Italian marble floors and beneath the vaulted ceilings of our shared prison. Dante did not merely inhabit the guest suite. He colonized it, transforming the pristine, cream-colored sanctuary into a bunker of artistic anarchy that seemed to pulse with a dark, radioactive energy. He dragged in heavy canvases that scraped against the walls, leaving marks I was too proud to clean, and filled the space with the hiss of aerosol cans and the pungent, sweet acrid smoke of marijuana. The ventilation system, designed to filter out the impurities of the city, was helpless against him. It betrayed me, carrying the scent of his rebellion through the vents and depositing it into my bedroom, my closet, and my lungs, a constant, inescapable reminder that my fortress had been breached by a barbarian who refused to be civilized. I attempted to counter his presence with a strategy of aggressive indifference, constructing a routine that kept me out of the apartment for as many hours as humanly possible. I threw myself into my university studies with a manic intensity, lingering in the library until the security guards began their rounds, and spent my weekends seeking refuge in the high-end boutiques of Madison Avenue. I accepted dates with the sons of my father's business partners, men with soft hands and softer chins who wore loafers without socks and spoke endlessly about their summer homes in the Hamptons. They were safe, predictable, and agonizingly dull, their conversations a soothing white noise that I used to drown out the dangerous frequency vibrating through my home. But no matter how late I stayed out, I eventually had to return to the penthouse and to him. Dante was inescapable, an omnipresent force of nature that seemed to suck the oxygen out of every room he entered. He didn't adhere to schedules or social norms. He existed in a fluid state of chaos that clashed violently with the rigid structure of my life. I would find him in the living room at noon, asleep on the couch with his boots on the silk cushions, or pacing the terrace at 3 in the morning, smoking and staring at the city with that terrifying, hungry intensity. He treated the apartment not as a home, but as a temporary squat, a place to be used and consumed. The sight of his leather jacket thrown carelessly over the grand piano or his spray paint nozzles scattered on the dining table made my skin crawl with a mixture of territorial rage and a strange, reluctant fascination. The kitchen became the primary theater of our hostilities, a neutral ground that was constantly violated. One humid Tuesday afternoon, I walked in to find him sitting on the granite island, shirtless, the muscles of his back shifting under a tapestry of black ink as he leaned over a box of sugary cereal. He wasn't using a bowl. He was eating handfuls directly from the cardboard, crunching with a loud animalistic rhythm that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. The sight of him, half-naked, sweating slightly, utterly at ease in his invasion, felt like a deliberate insult. His torso was a map of violence and art, covered in tattoos that looked like they had been etched with a rusty needle, telling stories of a life I had only seen in movies. He stopped chewing when he saw me, turning his head slowly to fix me with a mockingly innocent stare. A stray flake of cereal clung to his lip, but he didn't wipe it away. He just smirked, knowing how much his lack of manners infuriated me. "Hungry, princess?" he asked, the nickname dripping from his mouth like poison. He had started calling me that on the second day, using a tone that managed to turn the title into a slur, implying that I was useless, decorative, and fragile. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was a weapon, a way of reminding me that in his eyes, I was nothing more than a spoiled child playing dress-up in her daddy's tower. I felt the familiar flush of anger heat my neck, a sudden spike of adrenaline that made my fingers twitch. I walked to the refrigerator, pointedly ignoring his offer, and grabbed a bottle of imported sparkling water, needing the cold glass to cool my palms. "Put a shirt on, Dante," I snapped, keeping my back to him as I poured the water into a crystal glass. "This is a kitchen, not a locker room. We have staff. We have guests. Have you no concept of decency?" My voice sounded shrill to my own ears, brittle and defensive, lacking the cool authority I desperately wanted to project. I hated that he could reduce me to this scolding, uptight caricature with just his presence. He laughed, a low, rough sound that vibrated in the quiet room, and I heard the thud of his boots hitting the floor as he hopped off the counter. "Decency," he repeated, tasting the word as if it were spoiled milk. "That's a rich word coming from this family. You think wearing a tie makes you decent? You think drinking water that costs $10 a bottle makes you clean?" He moved closer, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, closing the distance between us with the stalking grace of a predator cornering its prey. I stiffened, gripping the edge of the counter, refusing to turn around and give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "I am asking you to show some respect," I said, spinning around to face him, trying to use my height and my posture to create a barrier. "You are living here on my father's charity. The least you can do is follow the rules of the house." It was the wrong thing to say. I saw the change in his eyes instantly, the amusement vanishing to be replaced by a cold, hard glint of fury. The mention of my father's charity was the spark that ignited the powder keg of his pride. He didn't back down, he stepped forward, invading my personal space with a sudden terrifying speed that stole the breath from my lungs. He kept moving until my back hit the cold stainless steel of the refrigerator, trapping me in the narrow V between the appliance and the granite countertop. He loomed over me, placing his hands on the counter on either side of my hips, boxing me in with his arms. He was so close that I could see the individual flecks of gold in his dark irises, smell the intoxicating, overwhelming scent of spray paint, old tobacco, and hot masculine skin. He radiated heat like a furnace, a physical force that seemed to sear through the thin fabric of my designer dress. I looked up at him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, waiting for him to strike, to shout, to do something violent. But he didn't yell. Instead, he leaned down, his face inches from mine, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was far more menacing than a scream. "Charity?" he hissed, the word vibrating against my ear, sending a shiver racing down my spine. "You think we're here for charity? You think my mother married that shark because she needs his money?" He laughed again, a short, humorless bark. "Open your eyes, princess. Your father isn't a savior. He's a crook in a three-piece suit. A thief who steals with a fountain pen instead of a knife." I opened my mouth to defend him, to tell Dante he was a liar, but the words died in my throat. There was such absolute conviction in his voice, such a raw, unfiltered certainty, that it silenced me. "He needs us," Dante continued, his breath hot on my neck, his lips brushing the sensitive skin below my ear. "He needs Evelyn to make him look human, to wash the blood off his money. Why do you think he brought us here? We're not family. We're a PR stunt. We're the diversity hire for his soul." His words were acid, burning through the naive narrative I had constructed about my father's whirlwind romance. I wanted to push him away, to slap his arrogant face, to scream for the housekeeper. My hands came up, flattening against his chest to shove him back. But as my palms made contact with his skin, something treacherous happened. I didn't push. My hands froze there, resting on the hard, warm expanse of his pectoral muscles. I could feel the steady, powerful thump of his heart beneath my fingers, a rhythm that was slower and stronger than my own frantic pulse. The texture of his skin was rough, different from the smooth, manicured men I knew. It felt real. It felt dangerous. And in that split second, the anger that had been fueling me transmuted into something else entirely. A dark, heavy liquid that pooled in my stomach and made my knees weak. I looked up at him, my lips parted, and saw that he felt it too. The contempt in his eyes had darkened into something possessive, a hunger that had nothing to do with cereal and everything to do with the girl trapped in his arms. He didn't move away. He leaned in closer, pressing his hips against mine, creating a friction that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. The air in the kitchen became thick and suffocating, charged with a static tension that threatened to snap. I realized with a jolt of horror that I didn't want him to stop. I didn't want him to back off. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the billionaire's daughter or the perfect student. I was just a woman, pinned against a fridge by a man who hated me, and the sensation was the most exhilarating thing I had ever felt. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, losing its edge of mockery and gaining a dark, velvety texture. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact. He could feel the tremors running through my body, the betrayal of my nervous system. He moved one hand from the counter and traced the line of my throat with his thumb, his touch rough and calloused, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. "Are you scared, princess? Or are you finally starting to understand how the real world works?" I couldn't speak. My voice had deserted me, leaving me defenseless. I just stared at him, caught in the magnetic pull of his gaze, unable to look away. I saw the challenge in his eyes, the dare. He was waiting for me to run, to scream, to prove him right about my weakness. But I didn't run. I stood my ground, my breath hitching, my hands curling slightly into the muscle of his chest, gripping him instead of pushing him away. It was a silent admission, a crossing of a line that I knew I could never uncross. The sound of the front door opening down the hall shattered the moment like a hammer hitting glass. We sprang apart, the spell broken by the intrusion of reality. Dante stepped back, his face instantly closing down into a mask of bored indifference, though his chest was heaving slightly. He picked up his cereal box, cast one last, unreadable look in my direction, and sauntered out of the kitchen toward the guest wing, leaving me leaning against the refrigerator, gasping for air, my skin burning where he had touched me, terrified by the realization that the enemy had just breached the last of my defenses. The departure of my father and Evelyn for the charity gala in Zurich was orchestrated with the precision of a military extraction, a flurry of Louis Vuitton luggage, hushed conversations with personal assistants, and the final echoing thud of the heavy front door that signaled the beginning of my solitude. The silence that descended upon the penthouse in their wake was immediate and oppressive, a physical weight that seemed to press against the high ceilings and expansive glass walls. It was a silence that amplified every creak of the settling building and every distant siren from the streets below, turning the luxurious apartment into a vast empty echo chamber. I sat in the living room, curled into the corner of a massive beige sofa that cost more than a luxury car, attempting to lose myself in the pages of a French novel, but the words swam before my eyes, untethered and meaningless. The air in the room felt charged, thick with a static tension that made the hair on my arms stand up, a silent warning that I was not as alone as I pretended to be. I turned a page without reading it, my ears straining for any sound from the guest wing, my heart beating a nervous, erratic rhythm against my ribs. The interruption came not with a noise, but with a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden darkening of the doorway that drew my gaze upward against my will. Dante stood there, framed by the arch, leaning against the doorjamb with a casual, insolent grace that infuriated me. He was holding a bottle of whiskey, not one of my father's rare single malts from the crystal cabinet, but a cheap, amber liquid with a peeling label that he must have brought in from the outside world. He did not offer me a glass. He did not speak immediately. He simply uncapped the bottle, took a long burning pull straight from the neck, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his dark eyes never leaving my face. He looked dangerous and out of place against the silk wallpaper, a stain of grit and reality in my pristine world. He walked into the room, the heavy tread of his boots sinking into the plush carpet, and sat down on the coffee table directly across from me, invading my personal space with a deliberate, aggressive familiarity. "Bored, princess?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the short distance between us. The nickname was a lash, delivered with a smirk that suggested he knew exactly how much it stung. He took another drink, his throat working as he swallowed, and watched me with a predatory stillness. "Daddy and Mommy are gone. Just the kids left in the castle. What are you going to do? Read your little book? Paint your nails?" The mockery in his tone was unbearable, a direct challenge to my dignity. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a flush of anger that burned hot and fierce. I snapped the book shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and grabbed the decorative silk pillow next to me. With a cry of frustration, I hurled it at him with all my strength, aiming for that arrogant smirk, screaming at him to get out, to go back to his hole, to leave me alone. He didn't flinch. He didn't duck. His hand shot up with the speed of a striking cobra, catching the pillow mid-air inches from his face. He held it there for a second, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric, absorbing the violence of my outburst with terrifying ease. Then slowly he lowered the pillow, his expression unchanged, his eyes dark and unreadable. He tossed the cushion onto the floor, a gesture of dismissal that was more insulting than if he had thrown it back. He stood up, unfolding his height until he towered over me, blocking out the light from the chandelier. The air in the room shifted from annoyance to danger in a heartbeat. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked at me with a focus that was intense and unsettling, like a wolf deciding it was time to stop playing with its food. I scrambled backward on the sofa, my heart leaping into my throat, realizing too late that I had provoked something I couldn't control. I stood up, my legs trembling, and tried to move toward the hallway, intending to retreat to the safety of my bedroom and lock the door. But Dante was faster. He moved with a deceptive, fluid speed, cutting off my escape route before I had taken 3 steps. He didn't run. He stalked, anticipating my movements like a hunter. I turned toward the grand staircase, hoping to reach the upper landing, but he was there, a wall of solid muscle and heat. He reached out and grabbed my arm, spinning me around, his grip firm but not bruising, just strong enough to let me know that struggling was futile. He backed me up until my shoulders hit the wall beside the staircase, the cold plaster a shock against my skin through the thin silk of my dress. This was not a gentle encounter. This was an assault on my senses, an invasion of my boundaries that shattered the polite veneer of our coexistence. He leaned in, placing one hand on the wall beside my head, boxing me in. The smell of him, cheap whiskey, spray paint, and the sharp musky scent of male sweat, filled my nose, overwhelming the delicate fragrance of the lilies in the vase nearby. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest, could see the pulse beating in the hollow of his throat. I looked up into his face, expecting to see triumph, but instead, I saw a raw, burning anger that mirrored my own. "You think you're safe here?" he growled, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "You think those diamonds and that daddy of yours make you better than me?" He leaned closer, his nose almost brushing mine, forcing me to look deep into the abyss of his eyes. "In my world," he hissed, "that money means nothing. It's just paper. Burns just like everything else. Here right now there are no bodyguards, no lawyers, just you and me." His words stripped away my defenses, exposing the fragile reality of my existence. He was right. In this moment my status was an illusion, a flimsy shield against the primal force of nature standing before me. I tried to slap him, a reflexive, desperate attempt to reassert dominance, to prove that I was still the mistress of this house. My hand flew up, aiming for his cheek, but he caught my wrist in midair, his fingers wrapping around my bones like a shackle. He held my wrist, not painfully, but with an absolute authority that froze me in place. We stared at each other, breathing heavily, the hatred between us crackling like a live wire. It was a volatile, toxic energy, a buildup of weeks of silent insults and cold glares. And then in the space of a single heartbeat the polarity flipped. The hatred didn't disappear. It transmuted, igniting into a firestorm of something else entirely. I saw his gaze drop to my lips, his pupils dilating until his eyes were black pools. I didn't pull away. I didn't scream. I leaned forward, driven by a madness I couldn't name, and when his mouth crashed down on mine it wasn't a kiss, it was a collision. It was violent, hungry, and devoid of any tenderness. He kissed me as if he wanted to devour me, to punish me, to consume the very air from my lungs. His lips were rough, tasting of whiskey and smoke, and his tongue invaded my mouth with a demanding arrogance that swept aside any thought of resistance. I should have been repulsed. I should have been terrified. Instead, a shockwave of electricity surged through my body, starting in my toes and exploding in my chest. I kissed him back with the same ferocity, my free hand tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, matching his aggression with a desperation I didn't know I possessed. The civilized world dissolved, leaving only the friction of our bodies and the sound of our ragged breathing. He didn't wait. He didn't ask. He shifted his grip, lifting me up against the wall as if I weighed nothing, his hands roaming over my body with a possessive, claiming touch. He dragged me toward the stairs, not to the bedroom but right there on the carpeted steps of the landing. He pushed me down, his body covering mine, a heavy, solid weight that pinned me to the earth. There was no romance in his actions, no soft words or gentle caresses. He was proving a point. He was showing me that beneath the silk and the money I was just flesh and blood, just a creature of instinct like him. He tore at my dress, the sound of ripping fabric echoing in the silent house, a final desecration of my perfect image. When he entered me, it was a shock that tore a gasp from my throat, a sensation of fullness and invasion that obliterated every thought in my head. It was rough, primal, and overwhelming. He moved with a rhythm that was ancient and undeniable, driving into me with a force that demanded total submission. And the most terrifying, shameful realization was not that he was doing this, but that I wanted it. I arched my back to meet him, my nails digging into his shoulders, my voice joining his in the quiet dark of the stairwell. I wasn't the billionaire's daughter anymore. I wasn't the pristine, untouchable princess. I was a woman on fire, burning in the arms of the enemy, realizing that the refined, polite boys I had dated were nothing but shadows compared to this blazing, destructive reality. We moved together in a frenzy of release, fueled by weeks of animosity and the intoxicating thrill of the forbidden. Every thrust was an argument, every gasp a concession. He was breaking me open, dismantling the walls of my ego, forcing me to acknowledge the animal that lived beneath my skin. I looked up at the vaulted ceiling, at the crystal chandelier that hung above us like a judgmental eye, and I laughed, a broken, breathless sound. The irony was perfect. Here, in the heart of my father's empire, amidst the symbols of his power, his daughter was being conquered by the one thing he couldn't buy, couldn't control, and couldn't understand. When it was over, we lay entangled on the stairs, the silence returning to the house, but changed now. It was no longer empty. It was heavy with the scent of our sex and the wreckage of the boundaries we had destroyed. Dante rolled off me, sitting on the step below, his chest heaving, his skin slick with sweat. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to comfort me. He reached for the bottle of whiskey he had left on the railing, took another swig, and looked back at me with a dark, satisfied smirk. "See," he whispered, his voice raspy and intimate. "Just you and me, princess. No money in the world can buy what just happened." And as I lay there, disheveled and undone, looking at the man who had just shattered my world, I knew he was right. The war was over and I had lost, but in the defeat, I had found a freedom I had never known existed. What began as a violation of my ego on the cold, hard steps of the staircase did not end with the bruising of my pride. Instead, it metastasized into a feverish, all-consuming obsession that rewrote the neural pathways of my brain. The memory of Dante's hands on my skin, the rough texture of his callous palms against the silk of my dress, became a phantom sensation that haunted me during the daylight hours, making my hands tremble as I poured tea or typed on my laptop. The hatred that had initially defined our relationship had been the fuel for a fire that was now burning out of control, consuming the oxygen in the penthouse and leaving me gasping for the thick, toxic smoke of our shared secret. We became lovers in the truest, darkest sense of the word, hiding not just from our parents, but from the very light of day, scurrying through the shadows of the apartment like creatures that could only exist in the dark. I stopped locking my bedroom door at night, a silent invitation that was as loud as a scream in the quiet hallway, and I would lie awake for hours, listening for the heavy, deliberate tread of his boots on the marble. When he came to me, he did not offer flowers or poetry. He brought the smell of aerosol paint, street dust, and the sharp metallic tang of the city that clung to his skin like a second layer of armor. Our encounters were frantic and desperate, driven by the constant, looming threat of discovery by the housekeeping staff or the sudden, unannounced return of my father. We made love in the guest bathroom, in the pantry surrounded by imported caviars, and once, terrifyingly, on the terrace while the city watched us with a million indifferent electric eyes. Dante did not just take my body. He began to systematically dismantle the narrow, suffocating boundaries of the world I had been raised in, dragging me out of the ivory tower and into the trenches of a reality I had only ever glimpsed through the tinted windows of a limousine. He started taking me with him on his nocturnal excursions, dressing me in oversized hoodies and torn jeans that hid my figure and my status, disguising the billionaire's daughter as just another girl from the block. We would slip out of the service entrance, bypassing the doorman who had known me since I was a child, and disappear into the humid, noisy embrace of the New York night. He showed me the city that existed beneath the postcard image, a sprawling, breathing organism of concrete and neon that pulsed with a rhythm my father's money could never buy. We rode the subway to the end of the line, standing shoulder to shoulder in cars that smelled of ozone and old pizza, surrounded by people whose faces were etched with a weariness and a resilience I had never known. He took me to the rooftops of Harlem, where we sat on the edge of the world, our legs dangling over the abyss, watching the trains snake their way through the urban canyons like veins of light. Up there, with the wind whipping my hair across my face and the sirens wailing in the distance, the silence of the penthouse felt like a tomb I had narrowly escaped. One night, he led me down a flight of rusted iron stairs into the basement of a nondescript warehouse in Brooklyn, pulling me into a subterranean world that assaulted my senses with the force of a physical blow. It was an underground club, a legal gathering space where the air was so thick with smoke and sweat it felt liquid, and the bass of the music hit my chest like a sledgehammer, forcing my heart to beat in time with its aggressive tempo. There were no VIP sections here, no bottle service, no velvet ropes to separate the elite from the masses. There was only a sea of bodies moving in a collective trance, a raw, unpolished humanity that terrified and exhilarated me. I stood in the corner, gripping Dante's arm, feeling like an intruder who had stumbled onto a secret ritual, my eyes wide as I took in the scene. I saw things I had been sheltered from my entire life. Open drug use, fights that broke out and ended in laughter, lovers pressed against graffiti-covered walls. Yet, in the center of this chaos, Dante moved with the ease of a king walking through his court. People greeted him with nods of respect, with intricate handshakes that spoke of shared history and loyalty. Here he was not the charity case or the mistake, he was a legend, an artist whose tag was known on every line of the transit system. Standing next to him in the strobe-lit darkness, I looked at the men I used to date, the sons of senators and hedge fund managers, and they suddenly seemed like paper dolls, two-dimensional cutouts with no blood in their veins. They talked about the stock market and sailing. Dante talked about survival and expression. They held doors open for me. Dante held the world at bay for me. The contrast was devastating. I realized that the refinement I had been taught to value was just a euphemism for weakness, a lack of vitality that came from never having to fight for anything. In this basement, surrounded by people who fought for everything, I felt a surge of life that was almost painful. But Dante's influence extended beyond the physical. He began to erode the moral foundations upon which my life was built, chipping away at the pedestal where I had placed my father. We would return to the penthouse in the early hours of the morning, smelling of stale beer and clove cigarettes, and retreat to his studio, a room that had become the command center of his rebellion. The walls were covered in sketches and stencils, images of angry faces and broken chains, and the floor was a minefield of paint cans and rags. We would lie on the mattress he had thrown on the floor, ignoring the expensive bed frame, and he would talk to me, not about love but about power. He forced me to look at my father not as the benevolent provider who signed my credit card bills, but as the ruthless titan of industry that the rest of the world feared. "He isn't building a legacy, princess," Dante would whisper, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. "He's building a graveyard. Do you know where that money comes from? Do you know whose throats he had to step on to get that view?" One night, he pulled up a news article on his cracked phone screen, a report about a pending merger my father was orchestrating with a massive pharmaceutical conglomerate. To me, it had just been dinnertime conversation, boring talk about stocks and shares. To Dante, it was a declaration of war. He explained with a cold, furious precision that the merger was designed to strip assets and streamline operations, a corporate euphemism that meant firing 3,000 workers in a factory town in Ohio. "Those are real people," he said, tapping the screen hard enough to distort the image. "My cousin works there. His friends work there. Your dad is going to starve them to buy you another pony." I tried to argue at first, reciting the economic theories I had learned in my university classes about efficiency and market correction, but the words tasted like ash in my mouth. Dante didn't argue back with theories, he argued with reality. He told me stories of families losing their homes, of addiction rising in hollowed-out towns, of the suicides that followed the closing of plants my father had acquired. He stripped away the abstraction of capitalism and forced me to see the blood on the balance sheet. I lay there, staring at the paint-splattered ceiling, and felt my moral compass spinning wildly, unable to find north. The realization was a slow, creeping horror. Everything I owned, every dress, every jewel, every bite of food I had ever eaten, was paid for with the suffering of people I would never meet. I was not innocent. I was a beneficiary of a system that ground people like Dante and his family into dust. My father was a predator, a monster in a bespoke suit, and by living in his house and spending his money, I was his accomplice. The guilt was crushing, a physical weight that settled in my stomach, but instead of paralyzing me, it radicalized me. I wanted to hurt my father. I wanted to take something back from him, to balance the scales in some microscopic, petty way. I became a thief in my own home, a saboteur operating behind enemy lines. It started small. Dante mentioned he needed supplies for a massive mural he was planning, expensive aerosol paints that he couldn't afford. Without hesitation, I went into my father's study, opened the petty cash box he kept in the desk drawer, and took $500. Handing the money to Dante felt like an act of penance, a way to wash the stain of my privilege from my hands. He took it without a thank you, nodding solemnly as if I were paying a tax I owed, which in a way I was. But money wasn't enough. I wanted to steal something that my father valued, something that would sting. I began to raid the wine cellar, a climate-controlled vault that housed bottles worth more than a car. I would slip down there when the house was empty, my heart pounding, and select the rarest vintages, the ones my father was saving for a special occasion that would never come. I brought the bottles to Dante's room like offerings to a dark god. We drank $1,000 scotch out of plastic cups, laughing as the liquid burned our throats, using the expensive alcohol to fuel his creative frenzies. There was a savage joy in the waste, a thrill in destroying something my father cherished to feed the man he despised. I was redistributing the wealth one bottle at a time, turning the symbols of my father's status into fuel for his enemy. I became Dante's financier, his lookout, his partner in a crime that had no name. I bought him a burner phone, so we could communicate without my father tracking the data. I stole the security codes for the service elevator so he could come and go without being seen by the cameras. I learned the schedule of the housekeeping staff, the blind spots in the security system, the secrets of the building. I was using the skills of my upbringing, observation, silence, manipulation, to undermine the very structure that supported me. But as the weeks turned into a month, I began to realize that Dante was not just a lover or a revolutionary. He was something far more volatile. He was a bomb. The anger that drove his art and his passion was not a controlled burn. It was a wildfire that was consuming him from the inside out. He talked more and more about leveling the playing field, about doing something that would make the city listen, make my father listen. His murals were becoming more aggressive, appearing on buildings owned by my father's shell companies, gigantic, screaming accusations painted in red and black. I would lie in his arms, tracing the scars on his chest, and feel the tension vibrating in his muscles even when he slept. He was waiting for something, preparing for a confrontation that I knew was inevitable. I was playing with fire, dancing on the edge of a volcano, but I couldn't stop. The danger was part of the attraction, the adrenaline of the impending explosion, the only thing that made me feel alive. I looked at him, sleeping in the mess of his studio, surrounded by the stolen wealth of my family, and knew that he would destroy us all. And the terrifying part was that I was ready to hand him the match. I had crossed the line from observer to participant, from victim to villain. I was no longer the girl who drew a line on the window. I was the girl who was helping him smash the glass. I looked around the room, at the empty bottles of Petrus and the sketches of burning skyscrapers, and realized that I didn't want to save my family. I wanted to watch it burn, and I wanted to be standing next to Dante when the ashes fell, holding his hand in the ruins of the empire my father had built. The catastrophe did not arrive with the screaming sirens of an external emergency or the chaotic crumbling of the building's foundation, but rather with the terrifying silent click of the front door lock turning 3 days ahead of schedule. My father's return from Zurich was premature, a glitch in the matrix of our illicit freedom that caught us entirely off guard. shattering the fragile, feverish ecosystem Dante and I had cultivated in his absence. The penthouse, which had been vibrating with the chaotic energy of our affair, the smell of spray paint, the empty wine bottles, the unmade beds, was suddenly plunged into a state of suspended animation. I was in the living room trying to clear away the evidence of a late-night party, when I heard his footsteps on the marble foyer, heavy, deliberate, and terrifyingly familiar. He walked in not with the weariness of a traveler, but with the focused, lethal energy of a shark entering a feeding frenzy, his eyes scanning the room with a cold precision that missed nothing. He did not greet me with a hug or a gift from Europe. Instead, he bypassed the pleasantries entirely, his jaw set in a line of granite that signaled immediate, catastrophic danger. He walked straight to his study, the sanctum sanctorum where he kept the secrets of his empire, and the sound of the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. I stood frozen in the living room, a half-empty bottle of vintage Cabernet in my hand, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew what he would find. I knew that in my reckless desire to fund Dante's rebellion, I had gotten sloppy, taking more cash than usual, leaving the digital trail of the keypad entry exposed. The silence that stretched from behind the study door was not empty. It was heavy, pregnant with the gathering storm of his wrath. 10 minutes later, the intercom on the wall buzzed, a harsh electronic sound that made me jump and nearly drop the bottle. His voice came through the speaker, distorted but unmistakable, stripped of any fatherly warmth and replaced by the cold, metallic timbre of the CEO. Come to the study. Now. It was not a request. It was a summons to an execution. I walked down the hallway, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, every step a struggle against the instinct to turn and run. I passed the guest wing, where Dante was sleeping off the previous night's excesses, and felt a surge of protective terror. I had to fix this. I had to take the blame. I pushed open the study door and stepped into the lion's den, preparing to confess my sins to the man who held the power of life and death over us. My father was standing behind his massive mahogany desk, a monolith of power backlit by the panoramic view of the city he thought he owned. The safe, usually hidden behind a false panel in the wainscoting, was gaping open, a black maw revealing the empty shelves where stacks of hundreds should have been. He didn't look at the safe, he looked at me. His expression was not one of anger, which would have been manageable, but of a chilling, disappointed sorrow that was far more dangerous. He looked like a man who had been forced to make a difficult decision about a beloved but rabid pet. There is $50,000 missing, he stated, his voice quiet and even. And the logs show the code was entered by your user profile. The code only you and I possess. I opened my mouth to speak, to pour out a fabricated story about gambling debts or a shopping addiction, anything to keep the focus on me and away from the volatile young man down the hall. Father, I started stepping forward, ready to fall on my sword. But he held up a hand, silencing me with a sharp, cutting gesture. Don't, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Do not insult my intelligence by trying to protect him. I know you didn't take it for yourself. You have credit cards. You have accounts. You have no need for cash. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder, tossing it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy slap, sliding across the polished wood until it stopped inches from my hand. I looked down at the folder, the label typed in neat, sterile font. Subject, Dante Williams. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a few papers. It was a dossier, thick with surveillance photos, background checks, police reports, and transcripts. My father had been watching him. He had been watching us. I know exactly who took that money, my father said, walking around the desk to stand in front of me. And I know he forced you to open that safe. I know about his history, his violence, his manipulative nature. A leopard doesn't change its spots, and a criminal doesn't become a brother just because I signed a marriage license. He didn't force me, I whispered, the denial weak and trembling. I gave it to him. It was my choice. My father shook his head, a sad, patronizing smile playing on his lips. That is what victims always say, sweetheart. Stockholm Syndrome is a powerful thing. He picked up the file and opened it, revealing a grainy photo of Dante involved in a street fight years ago. He coerced you. He intimidated you. Perhaps he even threatened you physically. I have seen the way he looks at you, the aggression. You were scared and you gave him what he wanted to keep the peace. That is the truth we are going with." The horror of his narrative began to sink in. He wasn't looking for the truth. He was looking for a solution. He had constructed a story that exonerated me, his precious daughter, while painting Dante as a monster who had infiltrated our home. "I have already called the police commissioner," he continued, checking his platinum watch. "The officers are on their way. We are pressing charges for grand larceny, extortion, and—" He paused, his eyes hardening into flint. "Grooming. Given his prior record and the amount stolen, he will be looking at 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. He will be gone by dinner." I stared at him, unable to breathe. He was framing Dante. Not for the theft. Dante had technically taken the money I gave him, but for the coercion, for the violence that didn't exist. He was using the legal system as his personal hit squad to remove an inconvenience from his life. "You can't do that," I gasped. "Evelyn. She won't let you. That's her son." My father laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Evelyn is a pragmatic woman. When she sees the evidence of his theft, when she hears that he threatened her stepdaughter, she will cry, yes. But she will understand that he is a cancer that needs to be cut out to save the family." "He didn't threaten me," I screamed, the panic finally breaking through my paralysis. We are together. I love him." The confession hung in the air, raw and undeniable. My father's face didn't change. He didn't look shocked. He looked bored. "I know what you think you feel," he said dismissively. "He seduced you. He used his street charm to manipulate a naive girl to get access to my money. It is a tale as old as time. It is not love, it is exploitation. And I am ending it." He walked to the window, turning his back on me. "The police will be here in 20 minutes. You will tell them exactly what I told you. He forced you to open the safe. If you deviate from that script, if you try to save him, then you become an accomplice. And I cannot protect an accomplice." The threat was implicit but clear. If I stood by Dante, I would go down with him. My father would destroy us both rather than let his authority be challenged. But if I played the victim, I would remain the princess in the tower, safe, wealthy, and alone. I looked at his back, at the perfect tailoring of his suit, and realized that Dante was right. He wasn't a father. He was a corporation. He didn't care about my happiness or my heart. He cared about his assets and his image. Dante was a stain on the brand, and I was a liability that needed to be managed. I turned and walked out of the study, my entire body vibrating with a cold, crystalline rage. I didn't slam the door. I closed it softly, sealing him in with his lies and his power. The hallway seemed to stretch out for miles, the walls closing in on me. My world was collapsing. The police were coming. Dante was going to prison, a real prison this time, a place that would chew him up and spit him out, all because I had tried to play Robin Hood with my father's money. I had to warn him. I had to tell him to run. I reached the guest wing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But I didn't have to go into his room. Dante was standing in the hallway, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He was fully dressed, his leather jacket on, a duffel bag at his feet. He wasn't asleep. He hadn't been asleep. He looked at me with eyes that were clear, alert, and devoid of any fear. He had heard everything. The acoustics of the penthouse were deceptive. Voices carried down the long corridors like whispers in a gallery. "He's good," Dante said, his voice calm, cutting through my panic like a knife. "I'll give him that. He spins a good story. Rape, extortion, theft." He hit all the high notes. He pushed off the wall and walked toward me, stopping inches away. He didn't touch me. He just looked down at me, his gaze searching my face for any sign of hesitation. "The cops are on their way, princess. Heavy hitters. They aren't coming to ask questions. They are coming to make an arrest." "You have to go," I whispered, grabbing the lapels of his jacket. "Run. Take the service elevator. Get out before they get here. I'll stall them." Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and blinding. "I'm so sorry, Dante. I didn't know. I didn't think he would do this." He reached up and wiped a tear from my cheek with his thumb. his touch rough and grounding. "Running doesn't work," he said. "Not from men like him. He has resources. He'll hunt me down. If I run, I look guilty. If I stay, I'm convicted." "Then what do we do?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I can't let them take you. I won't let them." He looked past me toward the study door, a cold, calculating fury in his eyes. "There is only one way out of this," he said. "We don't play his game. We flip the board." He looked back at me, and the intensity of his stare pinned me to the floor. "I'm leaving. Not running, leaving. And I'm taking what's mine." "He'll kill you," I sobbed. "He'll bury you." Dante shook his head. "Not if I have leverage. Not if I have you." He stepped closer, his body heat enveloping me. "This is it, princess. The fork in the road. You can stay here, cry to the police, play the victim, and let your daddy pat you on the head while I rot in a cell. You can keep the shoes and the parties and the safety." He paused, letting the weight of the alternative sink in. "Or," he whispered, "you can walk out that door with me right now. You can be an accomplice. You can be a criminal. You can burn this whole life to the ground and come with me into the dirt." He didn't make it sound romantic. He made it sound terrifying. He was offering me a life of fugitive uncertainty, of danger, of being hunted. "Choose," he said, his voice hard as stone. "Right now. Are you his daughter, or are you mine?" The question hung in the air, vibrating with the tension of the approaching sirens. I looked at the closed door of the study, where my father was waiting for me to betray the man I loved. I looked at the elevator, the metal doors gleaming under the lights. I looked at Dante, the man who had broken into my life and shown me that I was alive. I thought about the safety of my bed, the endless brunch dates, the numb, hollow feeling of my existence before him. And then I thought about the roof in Harlem, the taste of cheap whiskey, the fire in my veins when he touched me. The choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between death and life, between being a doll in a glass box and being a woman in the world. I reached down and grabbed his hand, interlacing my fingers with his. His grip tightened instantly, crushing my knuckles, a silent vow. "Yours," I whispered. "I'm yours." A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile I had seen since my father returned. "Good," he said, "because we aren't just leaving. We're going to make sure he never forgets us." He picked up the duffel bag with his free hand and pulled me toward the elevator. "Do you know where he keeps the digital keys? The ones for the offshore accounts." I stopped, looking at him in shock. "The black ledger?" I asked. "The encrypted drive?" Dante nodded. "If we're going to be criminals, let's be rich criminals. He wants to frame me for stealing 50 grand? Let's show him what a real robbery looks like." I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made me dizzy. It was madness. It was suicide. And it was perfect. "I know where it is," I said, a fierce grin mirroring his own. "It's in the wall safe behind the Matisse. And I know the code." The decision to incinerate my former life was not a calculated chess move pondered over days of agonizing deliberation. It was an instantaneous biological reflex, as sharp and irreversible as the snap of a spinal cord. Standing there in the hallway with Dante, his hand crushing mine in a grip that felt like a lifeline thrown across a chasm, I felt the last vestiges of the billionaire's daughter dissolve into the ether. The girl who worried about galas and reputation was dead, murdered by her father's betrayal, and in her place stood a woman forged in the fires of survival and rage. I looked at the elevator, then back toward the master suite where my father, in his infinite arrogance, had likely retired to wait for the authorities, confident that his rats were trapped in the maze he had built. He underestimated us. He assumed that fear would paralyze us, that we would cower in our rooms waiting for the executioner. He didn't realize that by backing us into a corner, he had stripped us of the only thing that kept us civilized, the hope of a future within his world. We retreated not to the elevator, but to the shadows of the guest wing, moving with the silent, practiced stealth of predators who have hunted in this territory before. We waited. The 20 minutes he had promised for the police arrival came and went, a bluff designed to break our spirits, or perhaps a delay in the dispatch. The silence of the house returned, heavy and suffocating, settling over the furniture like dust. Eventually, the lights in the study went out. Then the lights in the master bedroom dimmed. My father, secure in his belief that his word was law and that Dante was running scared in the streets, had gone to sleep. It was the ultimate insult, a testament to how little he feared us, and it was the mistake that would cost him his empire. He thought he was the king sleeping in his castle. He didn't know he was sleeping on a pile of dynamite, and we were holding the fuse. At 3 a.m, the hour of ghosts and thieves, we moved. I led Dante down the long carpeted corridor toward the master suite, my bare feet making no sound on the plush wool. The house felt different now. It wasn't a home anymore, it was a target, a bank vault that we were about to crack. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm, a war drum in my chest that drowned out the fear. We pushed open the double doors of the master bedroom, inching them forward until the gap was wide enough to slip through. The room was vast, bathed in the blue light of the city filtering through the sheer curtains. My father and Evelyn lay in the massive bed, 2 lumps under the silk duvet, breathing the deep rhythmic breaths of the innocent and the oblivious. We crept past the bed, moving toward the large abstract Matisse painting that dominated the far wall. It was a piece my father loved to show off to guests, bragging about its provenance and price tag, never revealing that its true value lay in what it concealed. I reached behind the heavy gilt frame, my fingers finding the hidden latch I had watched him use 100 times when he thought I wasn't looking. The painting swung outward on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing the face of the wall safe embedded in the concrete. It was a high-security model, digital and biometric, a fortress designed to keep the world out. But my father, in his vanity, had used a code that was sentimental to him, a sequence of numbers related to the day he made his first million. I keyed in the numbers, the keypad glowing with a soft, green luminescence in the dark. 81994. The mechanism whirred, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room, but the sleepers in the bed did not stir. The heavy steel door clicked and popped open. I reached inside, my hand steady, fueled by a cold, crystalline focus. The first thing I grabbed was the cash, stacks of banded $100 bills, the walking around money my father kept for emergencies. I tossed them to Dante, who shoved them into his duffel bag without a word. But the cash was just the appetizer. The main course was sitting on the top shelf. It was a sleek, black external hard drive and a physical leather-bound ledger, the analog backup my father kept because he didn't trust the cloud. I knew what was in that ledger. I had heard him whispering about it on late-night calls, seen the way he guarded it with his life. It contained the keys to the kingdom, the access codes to the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Zurich, the shell companies, the bribes paid to senators and regulators, the dirt on his competitors. It was the black box of his empire, the compiled evidence of 20 years of ruthless illegal accumulation. I pulled it out, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was heavy, dense with secrets and power. I handed it to Dante, and I saw his eyes widen as he realized the magnitude of what we were stealing. We weren't just taking money, we were taking his soul. We retreated to the study, leaving the bedroom door slightly ajar, and connected the drive to his secure terminal. I knew his passwords. I had installed the keylogger on his laptop months ago during the height of my rebellion, a petty act of spying that had suddenly become a weapon of mass destruction. We worked in silence, the blue light of the monitor illuminating our faces. I accessed the offshore accounts, the ones hidden behind layers of encryption and dummy corporations. With a few keystrokes, I initiated a transfer. I didn't send the money to a bank account where it could be frozen. I converted it. I moved millions of dollars into untraceable cryptocurrency wallets that Dante had set up on the dark web, funneling the lifeblood of my father's business into the digital ether where he could never reach it. It took 10 minutes to drain the liquid assets of the slush fund, 10 minutes to strip him of the liquidity he used to bully the world. The progress bar on the screen crawled forward, a green line of liberation. When it hit 100%, I ejected the drive and wiped the local logs, leaving no trace of where the money had gone, only that it had vanished. We packed the drive and the ledger into the bag, zipping it shut with a finality that felt like closing the lid on a coffin. We were done. We had the money, we had the leverage, and we had the evidence to bury him if he ever came after us. We stood in the center of the study, looking around at the leather books and the trophies, and I felt a surge of triumphant nausea. We left the apartment not through the service elevator, but through the front door. We walked out into the hallway, the duffel bag heavy on Dante's shoulder, and I did something that was both petty and symbolic. I left the heavy front door of the penthouse standing wide open. It was a message, a gaping wound in the security of his fortress, a sign that the violation had come from within. We took the elevator down to the garage, bypassing the doorman, and climbed into my father's vintage Porsche, the keys for which I had swiped from the bowl in the foyer. The engine roared to life, a guttural growl that echoed in the concrete bunker of the garage, and we sped out into the New York night, leaving the glass tower and the lies behind us forever. The drive south was a blur of adrenaline and caffeine, a fever dream of highway lights and the rushing wind. We ditched the car in a long-term parking lot in Newark, wiping it down for prints, and took a series of buses and trains, moving like ghosts through the infrastructure of the country. We didn't look back. We didn't check our phones. We just kept moving, driven by the knowledge that when the sun rose over Fifth Avenue, the world we had left would explode. And explode it did. By the time we crossed the border into Mexico 3 days later, walking across the pedestrian bridge with our heads down and our hearts pounding, the news cycle had already caught fire. We sat in a dusty internet cafe in Tijuana, watching the CNN broadcast on a flickering screen. The headline screamed in bold red letters, "Billionaire heiress kidnapped." The narrative my father had spun was masterful, a work of fiction that painted him as the tragic victim. He claimed that his unstable, criminal stepson had abducted me, forcing me to open the safe and empty the accounts before dragging me across state lines. He was on the screen, looking haggard and devastated, pleading for my safe return, offering a $10 million reward for information leading to Dante's capture. He played the role of the grieving father to perfection, tears glistening in his eyes, begging the public to help him save his precious girl. I watched him lie to the world and I laughed. It was a cold, hard sound that made the other patrons look at me. He was terrified. He wasn't crying because he missed me. He was crying because his black ledger was gone, and he knew exactly who had it. He was trying to control the narrative to turn the world against Dante so that the police would shoot him on sight before he could talk. It was a smart play, a ruthless play, but he had forgotten one thing. I wasn't the victim. I was the architect. And I had the one weapon he couldn't counter with money or influence. We moved south, deep into the Baja Peninsula, finding a small sleepy coastal town where the roads were dirt and the internet was scarce. We rented a small villa on the beach, paying in cash, and settled into a life that felt like a dream. The air smelled of salt and lime, not exhaust and expensive perfume. We spent our days swimming in the turquoise water, eating fresh fish tacos, and sleeping in a tangled heap of limbs and sunburned skin. The money we had stolen was enough to live like kings for 10 lifetimes, but it wasn't the money that made us rich. It was the freedom. It was the lack of pretense. But we knew the silence couldn't last forever. My father's manhunt was intensifying. The FBI was involved, and his private investigators were scouring the globe. It was time to end the game. One evening, sitting on the terrace with a bottle of tequila and the sound of the waves crashing below, I took the burner phone we had saved for this exact moment. I asked Dante to take a photo. We huddled together, the sun setting behind us in a blaze of orange and purple fire. We weren't looking scared or coerced. We were laughing, holding cocktails, tanned and vibrant and undeniably, visibly in love. I held up a piece of paper in the photo, on which I had written a date and a smiley face. I composed the message with the precision of a sniper. "We aren't lost, Daddy. We're free. Stop the search. Call off the dogs. If you try to find us, if I see one more news report about a kidnapping, the entire contents of the black ledger, the bribes, the offshore accounts, the senators will be sent to the New York Times, the FBI, and the IRS. We have copies. We have a dead man's switch. Go on TV. Tell them you were wrong. Tell them I ran away. Tell them I'm dead. I don't care. Just leave us alone." I attached the photo and the first 10 pages of his illegal ledger as proof of life. I hit send. We sat there watching the phone, imagining the scene in the penthouse thousands of miles away. I imagined the notification pinging on his phone. I imagined the blood draining from his face as he saw the photo, as he realized that his hostage was actually his executioner. He would see the ledger pages. He would know that we weren't bluffing. He would understand with crystal clarity that his empire was being held hostage by the daughter he had underestimated and the stepson he had despised. The response came 24 hours later, not to my phone but to the world. We went to the local bar to watch the news. My father was holding a press conference. He looked older, smaller, defeated. He stood at the podium, his hands gripping the wood, and delivered the performance of his life. He announced that new evidence had come to light. He claimed that the police had found conclusive proof that I had perished in a boating accident shortly after leaving New York, a tragic mishap during a manic episode. He asked for privacy to grieve. He was declaring me dead to save himself. It was the most cowardly, selfish thing he had ever done, and it was exactly what we wanted. He was closing the case. He was calling off the FBI. He was burying his daughter to bury his secrets. The world mourned the billionaire heiress, and the investigation was quietly shelved. I stood in the bar watching my own obituary being written in real time, and I felt a profound, weightless sense of relief. The girl on the screen, the one in the gala dresses and the stiff smiles, was gone. She had never really existed anyway. I walked out of the bar and onto the beach, where Dante was waiting for me by the water's edge. The night was warm, the stars hanging low and bright over the ocean. He held out his hand and I took it, feeling the rough calluses that I loved. We were ghosts now, erased from the system, dead to the world that had tried to crush us. We had no names, no history, only the future we had stolen and the fortune we had liberated. "So," Dante said, pulling me close, his voice rumbling against my chest. "You're officially dead, princess. How does it feel?" I looked up at him, at the man who had dragged me out of the tower and into the light, and smiled. It was a fierce, dangerous smile, the smile of a woman who had burned down her own house to warm herself by the flames. "It feels," I whispered, kissing him as the tide washed over our feet, "like the first breath I've ever taken." We turned and walked down the beach, two wealthy, happy ghosts disappearing into the dark, ready to build a kingdom of our own on the ruins of the one we had destroyed.